manufacturing requires a lot of power depending on the industry you're in. And so utility rates, cost, availability, and reliability are measures that have become much more important to the earlier decisions. And in fact, because of that, real estate options that actually have the power capacity that's required has, in some cases, if it's a large enough requirement, you need 400 acres and you need 10 megawatts of power. We're not starting with labor. We're starting with real estate options because, if you have a time frame that's under a certain amount of years, we need to find something that you can build on quickly. And then can you make the labor work? We'll do that on the back end.
Your data has secrets. Secrets that could change everything if you only knew where to look. Welcome to the Data Secrets Podcast. Welcome to the Data Secrets Podcast. Today's guest, he loves digging into data to help companies figure out where they should be in the world. Nat Estes, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, welcome.
Short and sweet intro.
Nat, so you are at FrameShift Consulting. You and I worked together back in the day at Cressa Consulting, and you are part of this elite group of amazing location strategy and incentives people. But for the listeners, can you just tell us a little bit about who is Nat, what is FrameShift, and what are you guys up to?
Yeah, sure. It's funny. I wish I could go back and find it might be on LinkedIn, actually, you reaching out to me, and you described, what was on our Cressa Consulting as something like in a very Nathan Sedambrini way, like it's selling this sexy, small, startup, cool consulting gig. And meanwhile, I was at this big shop, and it just happened to time perfectly. I'm like, that sounds great. Let's go get coffee. But FrameShift Consulting is, you said it well, right? Location strategy, economic development, incentives, advisory firm. What does that mean? Right? We help companies figure out where they're going to have operations and why. And the vast, vast, vast majority of our work is with companies that manufacture and distribute products and goods. There was a period of time where we did lots of this work for the tech world. We were trending away from that already heading into 2020, and then 2020 was a catalyst for us to be 95% doing work with the industrial world. So I guess our specialty would be helping companies figure out their manufacturing locations. There's a lot of reshoring going on, but a big part of what we do is on the network optimization side, meaning where do you have distribution centers? Well, that has a lot more to do with things like freight and transportation and customer service. So the data that we look at spans from, economic data, labor data, freight information and data, and then obviously there's quantifiable metrics on, economic development incentives and impacts that those have on these decisions.
Okay, so if I'm your grandma and I know nothing about most of what you just said, let's see. So I would understand that you help businesses figure out where they should put their office, warehouse, or manufacturing facility.
That's exactly right. If you were my grandma, I would say I would point to the nearest manufacturing facility that registered with her, and I would say somebody helped them make that decision. And before they started building it, that person was me.
Or they put a wet finger in the wind and
for sure.
And we're like, you know what? We want to be in Peachtree City or wherever, right? So I think the value that you guys add is making that decision super well informed on can we hire the right people there? Can we do that in the cheapest possible way? Or, is there some
you're making our clients already sound bad. They put a wet finger in the air, cheapest possible labor. I'm gonna give them a little bit more credit. I would say typically if it's a smaller entity, right there, like anybody else, if you are starting something up, you start it where you're familiar with it and you're typically in your backyard. But yes, you're right. There is always some sort of thought process going into these, and probably the hardest ones are the ones that grow up in a smaller community and they've had success, but they've kind of feel like they've tapped out what they can do there, and or their customer base has grown because they've been successful, and so they're going into an expansion. When we're working with a company, you would think that the more challenging entities we work with are the Fortune 250s, the very, very large privately held ones. But the most interesting ones are the ones that are making a decision that will literally double their footprint because it's plant number two, location number two. And it's
Mm-hmm.
number one was something that they did because it was right there. This is the first time they're going through it. Those are the sorts of clients where the handholding and decision making is incredibly relevant. That's the data is what it is. It's more of helping them feel comfortable that this is a financial decision that they can make that will bolster their growth.
And are these decisions often domestic or can they be global? What's
Yeah,
the breakdown?
vast majority of our work is North America,
Okay.
USA, Canada, Mexico. However, we have done projects in South America and Europe as well. And in fact, the tech world, we used to do a lot more international stuff. Once upon a time, a very well-known tech firm that had has a very well-known owner now. Um, Prior to him taking over, we were engaged to help with an Africa location strategy for that company to help them figure out where they start building their footprint there. So, and you want to talk about discrepancies and variances in data reliability, data sources, and how to triangulate information, get outside of the comfort zone of, the good old US of A. And you've got some interesting decisions to make on how to trust or, rely on data that you get.
Yeah, that's awesome. Um, so how how does one get into this field? Like, how did you make your way to
Yeah.
become a labor economist, or uh, what's your current moniker at the moment?
Yeah, well, that was never one that I put on myself, but it was certainly something that we used to hear when we would do pitches together. I mean, my path was this is a fairly niche world, but it's not that different from a lot of, I'd say, kind of more management consulting sorts of entities. Every arm of a large management, every management consultancy has some arm that does something like what we do. But my entryway to this was a varied background, right? I started in software sales, smiling and dialing for dollars. And I'm my next birthday, I'll be 40, which means I was working during the '08 financial crisis. And
Hmm.
um, that was a fascinating time to be calling on people. October 2008, picking up the phone, having a conversation. A week later, you're getting dial tones, you're getting disconnected lines. I mean, um, it was shocking to be able to feel like the economy had an on-off switch and somebody switched it off. And so leaving that world, I went to government contracting down in Louisiana. And then I've been, we met at Georgia Tech, and I've been in consulting ever since then. So my path is sort of varied, anyways, to get into consulting. But from where I was before to this group, who my two partners and I've been working together for 10 years now, that was probably less of a jump from working with clients. The commercial real estate world drives a lot of these sorts of things. Hence why we used to be part of a commercial real estate firm before
Hmm.
going back out on our own. Because commercial real estate brokers are the ones who are asked and tasked with, we're going to go lease a new building, expand. We want to go buy some land and build something, and inevitably those tend to be our second client or first client, depending on the relationship, than just the end client, who's the actual user and creator of the goods. So my learning curve was commercial real estate brokerage, and that's a steep one. Frankly, when you come from consulting, because you're used to having one client and now you have two. So hopefully that answered it, but it's a niche world. It really is, because you use the grandma example because I couldn't easily go, I'm an accountant.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think back in the day we would describe it because the Amazon HQ2 thing was so salient that would be like that's kind of what we're doing. We're helping companies like that figure out where that next location should be, and then also get the most economic incentives from the local municipalities, and almost make it a competition between a couple different cities who really want Amazon to come there, right?
Yeah, I was
Uh,
fortunate enough to recently I presented at the Virginia Economic Development Partnership conference, and we got to go tour the Amazon HQ2.
oh,
It
cool.
was really, because you're right, we used to use that all the time when that came online. That was like the easiest. That's what we do. Um, but it was really kind of fascinating to see that come full circle and actually go get to visit and tour it.
Yeah. Well, so you were doing like HR consulting, like people analytics kind of stuff, compensation and benefits and then no?
Yeah, just keep going.
Am I making that up? I don't
No, no, no. You're
know.
basically right. Yes.
Okay. And then let's see. And then you joined Cressa and you started doing location strategy analysis. What you just described maybe part of that journey, the learning curve, the data that you had to start to become familiar with, maybe some mistakes along the way, those kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I, well, first of all, the funny thing was I remember the first project I saw, what we sold it for at my previous firm would have been 3x, right? And that's because of our connection to commercial real estate and kind of the way that commercial real estate brokers and firms are compensated, because there was a back end to that. But, the data we looked at, going from there to a smaller group, we were small within, Cressa. It was that if we needed it, we had to go procure it. And there's a lot of entities that don't like to sell to consultants that have the gold mine of data. However, I mean, we subscribe to, I mean, tens, if not twenties, of data sets on, on labor, on utilities, on incentives, on demographic, psychographic data, and operating expense benchmarks, things like that, that were not all utilized in my previous world, which is much more focused on labor and people data and compensation data. Um,
Real
Go
quick, let
ahead.
me pause you. Can you for the people in the back, what's the difference between demographics and psychographics? I remember that the first time hearing that word 15 years ago and being
Yeah.
like, what are they talking about? They sound smart, but
Yeah, I
what's
guess.
the
I
what's the
don't know.
difference?
If you're a demographer, you probably really should be who you have on this sort of podcast for a data discussion. I mean, demographics effectively describe residents of a particular geography, whether it's, a census tract all the way up to the country, on I'll call it real. I wouldn't say real factors like psychographics is not real, but on information associated with your, your race and ethnicity, your age, your gender, your income bracket, your household status, things of that nature. That is really the basis of all the census information. That then from there, things like the American Community Survey build upon, and that's really the crux of a lot of information for, economic entities to make decisions for future state investment. Right, if you're on the other side of economic development, you're paying close attention to your residents' demographic figures because it will impact whether you are investing in utilities, schools, etc. Psychographics is more or less a behavior metric that is based on consumer spending, consumer behaviors, consumer metrics. There is some blending, depending on the data you're looking at, of those two to kind of make thoughtful kind of insights out of it. But those are
Yeah,
kind of one, you can think of one as metrics and one is behavior, but the behavior is still based in data metrics,
yeah,
like consumer spending.
cool. Yeah, sorry to stop you. Yeah, continue with
No,
the thread.
yeah, now you got to remind me what thread we were
Oh,
on.
we were we were talking about your learning curve,
Oh,
coming
yeah,
on board. Yeah.
I think anybody who's gotten kind of shifted into a new industry, new place where you're you have a skill set that is applicable, but you're maybe not as familiar with some of the information can relate to this, which is, the one of my biggest errors was pretty early on, and it was, we're helping a company make a big decision. And oftentimes companies have to determine in a new location, what will our operating expenses be? If they're not lower, 99.9 times out of 100, they're not doing it, because otherwise that there must be some other, strategic reason only that would guide it. But usually it's strategy that also leads to, operating cost savings. And so part of what we do is operating cost modeling on, if you were to pick up this operation, spend the capital to make this manufacturing plant, and all the adjustments in terms of savings on freight and labor, economic development cost offsets right in the early years because you're making this investment. We did this modeling work, and I did something that everyone has probably done in their world who deals with Excel and models. Grabbed an extra row, couple extra $1 million that made the location we were looking at seem significantly better than where they were currently. It was sent to the client, and I discovered it before we actually had the call, which meant we had about a 48-hour scramble of what do we do to make sure, because the story was still appropriate. The actual nominal savings, or the dollar savings, was not as significant. And so, this is quite frankly, we were very honest. There's only one way to handle it, in my opinion. Tell the truth, you try to solve it, and you try to be a good partner. And so we did all those three things. But at the end, we also said, well, we have assumptions built in. Are there ways and reasons to test these that are either too conservative or too aggressive that would allow if we were in their shoes, we use the old "what would you have to believe to make a decision" mentality, and it's all going to be based on data, but data tells the story. Now, what do you have to believe about that story to make the decision? So, I'll just say that the two clients that I had received that information differently. One was very, very, very upset, and it wasn't the end client who was the user. And it was a learning curve of who in the commercial real estate world really drives the dollars, if you will. So we got through it. Client, worked with us for many years after that, actually, and it was a great result. But it happens to the best of us. And I think, we talked about this, but we were at a conference together. You probably barely saw me because that was during this period of trying to get this solved. And I heard two people over, speaking that happened to be known about the incident. And it's one of those things that burned into your memory of thinking, I may even fix this with the client, and I still may lose my job. But I didn't, and here we are.
Yeah. Everyone loves a good fat finger Excel mistake.
Yeah, to be compounded on hearing somebody go, "Hey, I heard you might have to fire a guy."
Oh, jeez.
That's me. I've been waiting to tell that story. But, like I said, here I am.
That's awesome. Yeah, so obviously you've come a long way from that point.
That was 10 years ago, pretty much.
Right. And so now, you're now a co-founder in this new business. Let's kind of break down who you're serving and some of the things that you're actually doing for them. So who is your ideal client, and how do you serve them? How do you get in contact with them initially, those kind of things?
Yeah, we've worked with, like I said, some of the largest privately held entities in the world, and certainly the U.S., Fortune 250 companies and companies that have $30 million of annual revenue. Right? Our sweet spot's probably somewhere in the middle of those two ranges, which opens, and we're somewhat industry agnostic in that I could probably name clients in almost every major sector that there is, from the EV space and all the supporting industries to food manufacturing, to, anything in between that's, related to automotive suppliers of traditional sense. And, so how do we find them? Because we are partner led and in the weeds with our projects, there are days where I'm heads down for, 6 hours straight because we have project work to get done, and that's where we're spending a lot of time in data and analytics. But there's always got to be business development work that's done. And so reaching out to our brokers and our previous clients, right? Staying in touch with them. We're never going to be a company that has a marketing budget. If you know my partners, that's not something we're going to spend a lot of dollars on. We believe in the word of mouth. We also don't have to, have 30 projects a year. So, if we can be blessed with a handful of pretty big projects and a handful more of medium sized, we're going to have a great year and we're going to serve our clients really well. And our objective function is not revenue maximization because of that. It gives us the opportunity to be more thoughtful in our work and who we pursue. But this, right? You never know where the next opportunity is going to come from. So
Right.
we harp on staying in touch with the folks that we've worked with in the past. That's usually our best path forward. I think that answered it.
Yeah, I mean, because you're looking for clients who are in the process or about to make a big decision, right? And that's a challenge to, if you spray and pray and try to talk to a bunch of people, you know, they may make a decision like that once a decade
Yeah.
or right. And so, yeah, so that makes a lot of sense that you have to have a lot of relationships out there in the world. Quick plug for Nat and his partners. When I joined Honor, uh, Todd Olent was my boss. So Todd is one of Nat's partners. Matt Ryder uh, and I worked on one of our first BI projects together. And then Nat, I recruited you to come from because we were buddies from Georgia Tech MBA
Yeah.
program. Um, but I had no qualms about recruiting you to this team because I was like, these are some of the smartest, most well-respected people I've ever worked with. Like they're so smart that they have to come up with extra mind games to like keep themselves entertained sometimes. And so, yeah, I mean, these guys are the best in the business. And so, yeah, there's a shameless plug for. I love the way Todd described when you guys were starting FrameShift. He's like, we want to be craftsmen,
Yeah.
right? Uh, we just want to do really great work. We're at this very small niche, kind of location strategy, incentives, partner led, not trying to grow a big firm of junior analysts and that sort of thing. And so, kind of limited on the supply side. Um,
Yes.
and intentionally because you guys want to do really amazing work when you get retained. So,
Yeah. Yeah. We also need to, put food on the table. So
sure, sure.
we'll we'll pick up the phone when you call.
Yes, 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 yes. Cool. Well, let's dig into your process. Maybe let's focus on the location strategy
Sure.
work. Tell me about like some of the data sources, um, if you have a framework that you use as you talk about an end-to-end project. Because obviously, when a client starts a project with you guys, this is the Data Secrets podcast, right? All of that data exists out there somewhere and
Correct.
it's hidden, right? It's on government websites, it's in these proprietary data sources that you guys have access to, but it's also the way that you interpret that data is going to be uh, really different depending on the client's requirements, right? And so there's an element of understanding what do they care about,
Yeah.
right? So walk me through just the end-to-end process.
I feel like it's appropriate for me to share this again. I won't say the name of the client, but we were in the midst of a project of a client. So I want to go back because this is actually ties into two things.
Okay.
Yes, you said is right. The hardest part about what we do is we may do. When I was in Virginia, there was another person who does the same work, and they put it this way: it's like you're practically married to someone for 9 months, and then the project ends, and it's like you get divorced. Like you don't talk to them, and in some ways yes, in some ways no, but that feeling is fairly consistent because these are big decisions that get made, and once they get to a certain stage, right, it is on the client to then complete their process to get into the building and et cetera, et cetera. So you're right in that we stay in touch with people, but it's maybe that we don't hear from them. Well, the client that I spoke with this morning, we worked with them about 3 years ago, and the timing was nice when we were going back out on our own. They happened to reach out and say, "Hey, I think we might be doing something similar for another factory." Great. And so, we helped them establish, and they ended up in Alabama for the one 3 years ago. And we went through a very similar process as last time. And so when you talk about what the process is, we are defining evaluative criteria to help them make a decision. I mean, this could be applicable in any, like we used to say, we're basically just structured problem solvers, right? Because there is data proliferation. And I feel like I've been saying that for 5 years now. There's so much information out there, and there's a lot of easy buttons to press that it makes people who kind of get a little bit lazy because they feel like, well, this says the answer. So when that's why I don't want to like name what the entities or the data sources are, because if you can just Google labor analytics data, you'll probably come across multiple providers that we have assessed and used over the years. Same thing on the demographic side, and then on the utilities side, there's levels of information for granularity's sake. We're helping them figure out what they should prioritize. So when we did that and we presented this go around was the geographies that we are looking at. We've down selected from about 8 states. We've got about 8 markets that we're interested in. And they laughed. The guy, the CEO, said, funny that we ended up in Alabama last time in this county. And I said, well, because what we learned from last time and what we tweaked, we also were able to do things like look at smaller counties, smaller markets, because your headcount requirement is such that we wanted to ensure that you could find enough labor. So we kind of put a minimum threshold on what the labor profile looked like, the workforce information of your key standard occupational classifications. This time, because your headcount may be a little bit smaller, and in the industrial world, if you want to go find land and buildings that are actually within a price range that has a lower entryway, if you will, then you have to look at what we call micro markets, or counties that are 35,000 working age population or less. And so that alone was to your point of like, we can tweak the data and tweak the weighting and the prioritization just a little bit, and our end result can be dramatic, where a county and a municipality that looks like it is dead on bullseye now falls to the middle of the pack. And so that's the part that I think we have to be careful with in our world, is that we know that really, really well because we do this all the time. The clients don't always know that. We try to be extremely transparent as to why a place might be performing well or not. And this also goes back to what do you have to believe, right? Just because a county performs, or a municipality or metro or whatever it is performs very well based on certain metrics, do we believe it based on our experience of probably we've been there with a client recently, or we've done a little bit of ground truth investigation to figure out what's going on? Not always. And we have to tell the story that says the data says this, but we believe this. And unfortunately, what that means in our world, which is going to make this kind of not as fun to listen to, is that we might be saying that county or municipality looks good, but we don't think you'll be successful there. And I don't want to name names, because those are the people that are on the other side of the table when we go and do economic development work on behalf of our clients.
Yeah, that's interesting. So they basically asked you to do a repeat project.
Almost identical with minor tweaks.
And what was the time difference from the first project and the second?
3 years. In 3 years' time, especially in the industrial world, the last 5 years have changed significantly on manufacturing in the U.S. You can argue it's political reasons, but it was already trending this way because of kind of the nature of what was coming reshoring already.
Yeah, and so the first time you did that project, what were the general categories of things the executives care about that you would want to capture?
So this was an interesting one where Canadian-based company, and they had a shop that was in the U.S. already. It was unionized and operated kind of differently than what this one would look like. So some of the information we looked at was the labor availability, labor cost, labor competition, right? The big three, if you can understand those, you can understand the labor market dynamics in any geography. And so availability comes down to how many people have the skill sets that actually do the job literally that you need, or are in the next kind of ring of skills that could do the job that you need them to do. Availability also these days in the industrial world is if you don't believe that there's enough talent there or that you're going to have to poach talent, is there a growth pipeline coming in? And this is where we've seen tremendous change in the last 10 years of technical and community colleges across a lot in the Southeast and Midwest in particular, pushing hard for customized training programs that will allow for what do our employers need in our manufacturing community, and how can we build that pipeline of talent coming up? So that's another part of availability, understanding completions, certifications. Some of these are 6-week programs, but understanding what companies are taking advantage of those. And speaking of that, competition is the other. This is something where metrics are interesting because you could probably debate each one of them as to what do they really mean. I'll give you job growth rate as an example. We use that a lot, and I stand by it as a good measure because job growth rate in an environment of low unemployment means that a job growth is outpacing somewhere else. Either local employers are hiring more for those jobs, or a new market entrant has come in and started hiring. And so what does that mean for you as a company that is going to be entering that market as well? Well, it's low unemployment, a lot of job growth means that those people, there's not people sitting on the sideline, and you're going to be competing with whoever is doing that hiring today that's caused that increase in job growth rate. So that's a metric that we use as a level of competition. The flip side of that metric is job growth rate is great for the local economy. That means that people are getting jobs and wages, and that stimulates the economy. But it's funny from our perspective, we look at that and go, there's some level of it that if you're not keeping up with residential, demographic, growth rate of working age population, housing, everything like that, that's where these off balances occur in communities where they outpace things that need to happen on the other side so that the supply and demand kind of even out or stay roughly even. Because when you see that, you see these huge spikes in job growth rate, but where do people live? Housing costs, suddenly go significantly higher. Rent rates go significantly higher. That's not an ideal environment for you as an employer to go and enter. Right? You want to be at the beginning of that curve where you've got your workforce and you establish it. And the last one is cost, which is obviously, labor costs. It is what it is. What do you need to pay to get people in the door? What do you need to pay to get people to stay there? Right, and there's a minimum threshold number in most markets that, we talk to local employers and staffing firms about this in any project that we do. We probably talk to staffing firms in every state in the country for every one of our clients that have looked in those states for validating what data says. And so that's a key component of what we do is that the data gives us the information to feel very confident and comfortable that we have looked at this long enough to help the client understand what these 15 metrics really mean. But then we can layer on that the stories of local employers or staffing firms that put these people to work every day, and they know the dirty laundry that is who does well and who doesn't do well as an employer. And if you want to mirror one that does well, this is what that means to go be a successful employer in that community.
Nice. So to summarize, labor availability, competition, and cost. And so some of the data sources that you use to gather, you're pulling lots of different sources together into some sort of a model that's then score each location. Some of these data sources are like structured data that is available on the internet. Some you have to subscribe to, and then some are you literally calling these staffing firms, like picking up the phone and
Yeah. I mean, on a project like this that we're talking about, which is you're going to build a plant or manufacturing facility, right? We're not talking about the distribution side because there's a freight component that has even more data elements to it for distribution sort of work. But we'll hold that aside. But yeah, we call it ground truth, and it's picking up the phone, and something that I started my first job doing, so I'm not unfamiliar with doing that, and engaging with the staffing firms to locally, and oftentimes it's out of the blue. Sometimes we may have worked with them in the past, and inevitably are actually the good thing for them, their side, is if an employer comes there and they're establishing themselves, generally good practice is work with somebody who knows that local market and help get your first hires going. And even if it's just hiring an HR manager. So the staffing firm has, we're offering potentially to make a connection. Oftentimes we can't share who they are at that stage.
Right.
But when we come to town and do a tour and visit, that's when they may meet the client face to face. And, if they come there, they've built that relationship so that they can hit the ground running. But, I'll give a really good example of where data, right? Labor, we'll stay on labor for a moment, where labor data kind of goes in these, increases and plateaus. And 2016-17, the distribution jobs were going crazy, leading into what ended up being 2018, with, the first time we had that curve that crisscrossed of there was more job openings than there were unemployed workers, right? And the tons of the warehousing distribution jobs were leading to that change in that curve. Well, we're doing a project for a massive distribution center that was going to go into the Chicagoland area, which included parts of Indiana, way over to Joliet, Wilmington, up to basically Naperville and everything in between. It's a pretty big geography, and what we saw from the data was that it was lagging to where the spike had hit. And so there was about a $1.50, $2 an hour difference in what actually needed to be paid and what was being paid locally compared to what the data said. And it was just a correction in the market that hadn't been seen in compensation data yet. Oftentimes, because comp data has to lag by a certain amount of time in order to be utilized. And when you look at especially large like survey companies, Mercer and those alike, they have terms where that data has to lag a certain amount of time. So if we hadn't, before getting on the ground, pick up the phone and talk to local staffing firms, we would have been informing the client as they look at their operating costs with numbers that were going to be millions of dollars low in aggregate, because this was going to be a 500, 600 person distribution center. And if you're off by $2 an hour, across that many people, then the numbers get big quickly. And so by doing that, talking to those staffing firms, we heard what was really going on before we got on the ground with the client to go visit real estate options. And that made the visits so much better. It was talk about projects that give you some heartburn, was going into that, just hoping and making sure that the folks that we were going to talk to on the ground echoed what we had told the client ahead of time. And, it's one of those things, by doing that due diligence, you can breathe a sigh of relief because it's going to go according to plan.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I feel like a lot of analysts tend to just stop on the available data that I can get from my, from the comfort of my laptop. And
Which,
so,
yeah,
it's
there's
a
a lot to be said
differentiator,
for
I'm
that.
sure. Yeah. Okay, so we're going through the different kind of buckets of decision criteria. So labor is one.
Yeah.
So I imagine the question upstream from that you've asked executives are, what types of jobs are you looking for?
Yeah, and this is where we know what the occupational classifications, right? SOCs are the standard occupational classifications. If you use those for white collar jobs and that's the only thing you use, you're not doing your job well in my perspective, my point of view. For blue collar jobs, that data is actually pretty darn solid. And so if it is like most of our clients these days, manufacturing, distribution roles, a lot of machine operators, a lot of maintenance techs, you can utilize the government-based information that if you subscribe to a provider, they may do some modeling that modifies it, because if you're looking out 5 years, the government doesn't necessarily have that information or crystal ball, but like, real labor economists do that sort of thing. And so, yes, we're helping define what the skill set is so that we can, based on their jobs. The things that have changed in the industrial world are the cost of utilities and power and availability, right? Manufacturing requires a lot of power depending on the industry you're in. And so utility rates, cost, availability, and reliability are measures that have become much more important to the earlier decisions. And in fact, because of that, real estate options that actually have the power capacity that's required has, in some cases, if it's a large enough requirement, you need 400 acres and you need 10 megawatts of power. We're not starting with labor. We're starting with real estate options because,
Yeah.
If you have a time frame that's under a certain amount of years, we need to find something that you can build on quickly. And then can you make the labor work? We'll do that on the back end. But that's the biggest difference of what's changed in the last, especially in the last 5 years. And we can thank data center investment for a lot of that, is that they like to go find cheap land, tons of power, not a lot of jobs. So communities don't love them, but they've impacted manufacturing and distribution operations because of what they've done to utility availability, capacity, costs, and then real estate.
That's so fascinating. And so if you were looking for, if I'm just a tech company that's just a tech company. If I'm a tech company looking for an office in a major city, you're going to start with labor. But
Yes,
if I'm looking to build a big manufacturing facility or a data center or a even distribution facility, then you're going to start potentially with the utility side
a lot earlier,
a
right?
lot earlier.
If the requirement is in 24 months we want to be operational. Okay, well, if you're building something, then it needs to be as ready of a site possible with the power that you need, right? Because those are the long poles in the tent, right? The lead times on utility related investments, if they're not already in place, can be significant during the 2021, 2022, even the 2023. Some of the lead times on things like transformers were comical. I mean, I remember being in a meeting and the number that was used was 107 months, or sorry, 107 weeks, pardon me. And I'm like, why are we still using the metric weeks at this point? you know,
Yeah.
those things have somewhat normalized, but they're still expensive and longer lead time. So yes, that's what changed. But on the tech side, fascinating. Really, what we start with is, I hate to say this, but like, are you actually going to hire these people in that location? Like we're getting pushed into more of the workplace discussions of what are your policies and what do you believe to be kind of the future of this office,
Hmm.
right? And then we can drill in on the true roles that will be there and hired there and kind of cultivated in that market.
Yeah. Okay, so just moving on. So labor, utilities, what else do you consider?
Business regulatory environment, right? Things like minimum wage policies. I hate to say that because it feels like it becomes a political discussion, but if you're an employer of hourly workers, the minimum wage policy, even though it may not come anywhere near what you're going to pay because it's way below or significantly below your hourly wage, it is an indicator of the potentially the business regulatory environment of that state and kind of the quote business friendliness. So there's lots of rankings out there for business friendly, states or best in business states. In economic development, they love to harp on those rankings, and they look at a few key things, which are things like your tax environment is a big part of it. Right? If I have low corporate income tax, I have lower property tax, lower sales and use tax on manufacturing, then I'm going to do well in those. And so that's one of the reasons why the Southeast has done fairly well is that it's cheaper land, cheaper labor, cheaper taxes. Check, check, check. And then if they have, in some cases, cheaper utilities. So those metrics have become more relevant. And we've had some clients that are very specific about geographies that they're not going to go to because of XYZ on the business regulatory environment. There's a state out west that has had a fair amount of companies we've helped, find other operations in different states because they just don't believe that, and not that they don't believe it, they would point to their financials as evidence that this is not the friendliest and best place for us to do what we do.
Cool. And then I imagine like the actual real estate cost to lease or buy a building
Absolutely.
also factors in.
The call we this morning looking over that the very preliminary stuff that we had. I mean, there's a big difference between being near a metro and being in a county of 50,000 people, an hour away. Those
Yep.
numbers are pretty significant. And depending on the size of the investment, if real estate's going to make a big chunk of that initial capital, that's starting to move the needle as well.
And so then at some stage, so like as we start to, you've culled this data together, you're forming an opinion, you kind of go through like here, I think you said here's 8 states we could be in, and then do you like continue to bring that list down, and then eventually, when does that turn into incentives negotiations and that sort of thing?
Yeah, when you're down to two or three viable markets, and probably within that at most two or three viable sites, actual buildings or actual pieces of land, is when we're shifting gears to economic development incentives work. So
Okay.
yeah, it's a big down selection process, and you got to use some level of constraint or some level of decision making. Like what we'll typically do is like a lot of analytics. Like if you have a scoring mechanism and you believe in it, then use it. But there will be outliers, and so that's why we try to look at data in a visualized manner. Typically some sort of 2 by 2 plot where it's a cost and a quality metric. Because what you'll find is that high quality performers, when we're talking about geographies, no matter how you cut the data, the larger the market, they tend to outperform smaller markets. We do our best to weigh things like the concentration of the jobs rather than total jobs, and things of that nature. You can do that across every metric. But then you want to look at the outliers. If there's an extremely low cost labor market environment, but it's a tiny place and it's not easy to get to, well, let's have the discussion about it. Because if you don't like that, then it may help us carve out other places. Then we get to the final, down select, real estate, utilities, viable sites, and now we're down to, if you're down to two or three locations, most of the time we can make an argument you could be successful in any of these because we've done our due diligence. Now, there may be things that outweigh one versus the other, and this is where feelings, emotions, honestly, can get in the way of decision making, and that's okay at that stage. If we believe in any of the markets in any of the locations, how the client makes that decision there, we've done enough of our job where it's okay. So economic development incentives then come into play at that stage, understanding what the state, how the state views the project, the local municipalities, the sort of ad valorem taxes that we're going to create based on if we build a building or make significant capital investment. And then this is where data and feelings and usability is really interesting, because just because a place has lots of incentives doesn't mean that the client can use it if they're corporate tax incentives, and they're not going to have a corporate tax liability for 3 or 4 years because they're a relatively new entity, right? Or if it's training programs that they don't have the capacity or the kind of manpower to put behind those. Right? Those are the sorts of things that also just because they offer tax rebates probably means they have a higher taxing entity, and so where are you entering over the long term of a 20 or 30-year horizon? So that's where I could say I've made that mistake, is providing the kind of blanket, here's the offer, to people that don't look at it day in and day out and go, we're going to get $40 million worth of value from this place, and we're only going to get 6 over here. Hang on, let's pump the brakes. Let's look at what this really means and what you'll have to commit to in order to receive all that value. And then when it wears off, even though it's 20 years out from now, let's look at these from a comparison perspective then.
Yeah. And some of those things are, so some incentives are statutory where it's like written into the law, and if you do this, then you get this. But then some are more discretionary. Is that right?
Yeah.
How does that process work?
Yeah. I mean, if it's statutory, in theory, clients should be able to file paperwork on time, receive the benefit. There still are application processes and things like that, but those are written into law at the state level typically that say if you do X and Y, you will receive Z, and there are stipulations around timeframes and reporting. discretionary are things like governor's closing funds, local tax abatements and tax reductions on property taxes. Those can be extremely discretionary and you know vary within 2 to 3x depending on who you're talking to and how they view the project. Those are folks that do what we do. Our job is to maximize the value of those.
Yeah, and so how do you do that? Is it some combination of like networking and like relationship, and then some um, telling this compelling story and this fairy tale of like, oh, we're bring, and you're not lying, right? It's like, but hey, we're bringing this amazing company, is a great employer, well respected. They're bringing hundreds of jobs of this type to your community. It's a whatever, like, and so you try to sell the pitch. Is there any
Yeah.
other factors?
Well, it's data versus data. A lot of times we know the same data sources they're using. So if we provide them occupations, they're going to do the same math that we do. The magic in it is telling the story with it in a manner that's a, it's true. B, it's believable in the sense of the impact. And so I can think of one that partners worked on that per the requirements, the project wasn't meeting certain thresholds of wage levels. But if you went and looked at actually where their this is a local expansion opportunity, where their employees were coming from, were some of the lower income zip codes in the area. And these jobs were actually really good jobs for those people. And so this is something that they had an opportunity to expand there or go to another one of their sites. And so by highlighting that, it's saying like, we get it. You want, everyone to have $75,000 a year jobs. Well, these aren't that, but these are good jobs. And if you look at where the people who are in them today live, they are benefiting significantly from having operations like this here because this is the skill set that these folks have, and this is the wages that or income levels that they're now rising up to because of these jobs. So it's making it compelling and making it the right case for why it's good to have a diverse economy, because a lot of times in bigger metros, manufacturing and distribution can get overlooked for white collar jobs, and there's the healthy economy should have a diversity of those sorts of opportunities.
Are you allowed to tell? So, like, if you get, let's say, $5 million governor's fund or whatever it's called from one state, can you go to the other state and be like, hey, we got this from this other competing location. What do you got? Like, is there a bit of back and
Oh
forth?
yeah. Well,
Okay.
they, good ones know already, kind of based on the project characteristics, especially if it's a state they compete with regularly.
Yeah.
But absolutely, they should know. They should know as much as they can about the project so that they can make an informed decision. Because it's also they have the agency and discretionary fund to make a decision for what they want to put on the table for an offer. And like John Oliver did a thing on economic development incentives a couple of years back, and there's a belief that they're bad all around, but they exist and they're out there to be utilized, and it is funding that can lead to investment in jobs and good wages. And so it's the industry I'm in. I kind of have to wave that flag, but it's I do think that they're useful in these sorts of negotiations because they do help. I mean, it's kind of like the putting down the welcome mat, right, for a company that's coming to your town, and it's funds that
Yeah.
are out there that have been on the books for a long time in terms of some of those statutory ones by law,
Hmm.
um, and they're not going away anytime soon, from what I can tell.
That's awesome. Well, this has been super interesting. Let's let's land the plane here. I do want to hit, I want to give you a chance to tell your weirdest KPI story. So we'll
Yeah.
pivot to the metric mystery theater, our KPI corner lightning round. Uh, yeah. So in your world, what is one of the weirdest KPIs or evaluation criteria that you've seen?
Um, well, I enjoy when we work with our transportation freight folks, and they have carrier scorecards. Sometimes they have some funny things in there about the carriers they utilize, and I do enjoy those. But this one is this was We worked with a company that was effectively a customer support center for a psychic network. And, the running gag was like, well, why don't you just ask the psychics where you should put the support center?
That's awesome.
Right. We managed to keep our mouths shut on that and
Yeah.
never bring it up. But if you think about what these people were doing, they're kind of the go-between between clients and the psychics. And so their job sometimes was to stall-ish or gather information and be able to talk to the client, until their psychic was available or the schedule was appropriate for their time. And so in order to do that, these people have to sort of believe in this sort of thing. And so, this is talking about data that's not necessarily out there, but we were at the time, this was probably about 9 years ago, using, Google Analytics, Facebook scraping, things like, people who are in psychic fan groups on Facebook, voodoo, fan groups, things of that nature, that were kind of believed in the beyond, if you will, and created more or less an index associated with that. And so, if you think about places that get the moniker of, kind of a weird or funky sort of residents that live there, you can believe that those started popping up on our list,
Yeah.
because of this.
Sedona.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if there's crystal shops anywhere, that probably, what, in hindsight, that should have been one of our
That would have been a
metrics.
good one. Yeah.
But
Manitou Springs
yeah,
in
that's
our
right.
area.
So that was a fun one, just a KPI of belief, kind of a belief index, something we created.
So where'd they land?
Well, that part of the fun of what our work is, that halfway through they were pivoting, saying, actually, we're going to make a big push into South America, which means we need bilingual as well. That pushes towards the South, and everybody knows the moniker, keep Austin weird. They didn't end up in Austin, but they ended up in their big neighboring town, in San Antonio. So it was a fun project, and one that I'll never forget, especially just creating those that we really created a data set out of. I almost said nonsense. That would have been rude.
Yeah, but that's a fascinating
Out of
psychographic type
it
thing.
is
Yeah.
bingo.
Nat, thank you so much for being on the pod. If people want to connect with you, reach out, what's the best way to do that?
LinkedIn's great, right? FrameShiftLSI.com is our website. Actually had a broker use the contact us page just yesterday, which I always find
Oh, wow.
interesting. So you can do that. It'll go to my inbox, and then my information's out there.
Cool. Well, great conversation. Appreciate you. And that's the pod.
Thanks, Dave.